Welcome, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. We're so excited that you're here today. Welcome to our first ever virtual Diverse Voices event here at the virtual Baskin School of Engineering. We're thrilled that you're here. My name is Abigail Kahn, she, her, hers. I'm the executive advisor to the Dean of Engineering at the Baskin School. And I want just to take a moment and acknowledge this absolutely incredibly stressful year that all of us are dealing with. Students, you had to leave campus, your friends, your professors very abruptly without knowing when you were going to see them again, if you were going to see them again. Many of you have been sheltering in place in households where you're competing for privacy, you're competing for quiet, for internet access, technology. And I have to imagine that for our students who are graduating, this is a particularly difficult year, particularly hard. So I just want you to know that the faculty and staff at the Baskin School of Engineering are enormously proud of your courage and your resilience. Now, before I introduce our very special guest, I have just a few technical points that I want to make sure you are aware of. We're going to be having plenty of time for question and answers, so you should look at the bottom of your screen. There's a Q&A feature, and you will use that to type in questions. And my colleague, Melissa Baker, will be monitoring the questions, and then she will be the one who will ask our speaker to respond to those questions. And we anticipate that some of the questions may overlap in terms of what you're asking about or what you're commenting on. So if your own question is not asked, it's probably because it's very similar to another question. Let's see, the event is being closed captioned, and we want to thank our closed captioner. You can access the closed captioning at the bottom of your screen. You should be able to click on that, and there's a few options there. I also wanted to note that our speaker is going to be sharing with you some ways to follow her or be in touch at the end of the presentation, so you'll have an opportunity to stay connected in some ways. We're going to have about a 25-minute or so presentation from our speaker, and then we'll have the rest of the time for your questions. Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to thank my colleagues in the Baskin School of Engineering and University Relations for coming together to bring this to you virtually. We wish we were all in the same room, but this is also really a tremendous, kind of technology that is allowing us to do this, and so thank you to my colleagues. So let me tell you about Tara. We're honored to be joined today by software engineering pioneer, Tara Hernandez. Tara holds a BA in computer science from UC Santa Cruz and currently runs the developer platform engineering team for the Google Cloud platform. Before joining Google, Tara had a number of roles, including as a senior infrastructure engineer and team leader at Pixar Studios, where she and her team introduced continuous integration to the Pixar Studio Tools department. Tara was the open source project owner at Mozilla and was the release engineer and manager of the client release team for Netscape Communications. You could read all about Tara's other affiliations on her LinkedIn page. She has had a truly extraordinary career, and she shows no sign of letting up now. I also want to call your attention, and this is terribly important for what you're going to hear about tonight. In addition to her wonderful work her wonderful technical work as a software engineer, Tara has been a fierce advocate for diversity in tech, both within the companies that she's worked for, as well as helping lead advocacy organizations like Women Who Code, where she's an advisory board member, and Chick Tech, where she mentored high school students who are interested in STEM. Also Code 2040, which is a wonderful organization. I think she may talk more about that, and if she doesn't, we can perhaps bring it up in the Q&A and allow you to hear from Tara herself about Code 2040. So without any further ado, I give you your fellow banana slug, Tara Hernandez. Tara, thank you.
Had to unmute there. Hello, everyone. Nice to be here, wearing my Slug Pride shirt. Let's go ahead and get started. All right. So Welcome to my talk, Data-Driven Diversity. This is actually a version 2 of this talk. I gave a similar talk last year, and then I went back and got better data to try and frame a next generation. As Abigail mentioned, I'm a senior engineering manager at Google Cloud in Howell College, class of 95. It's been a while. So let's start this talk off with what do we actually mean when we talk about diversity? And there's a bunch of different ways that we can approach this. But we're going to talk about the way I think about it for the purposes of this talk, which is this: a recognition that humans can be categorized along the multiple dimensions of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, age, physical abilities, religious beliefs, political beliefs, or any other ideologies. We are all different. We can slice and dice ourselves in a variety of different ways. And all of them can be relevant for how we interact with the world, and more specifically, how we interact with each other within the context of a company environment. So let's talk about my diversity stats. I'm not shy, I'll share. So Irish, Mexican, American. So I like whiskey and tequila. I'm female, I am old. Member of the LGBTQ community. I am leaning atheist. My wife won't let me say I'm fully atheist. She says you must always leave room for exploration. I'm perpetually klutzy. This isn't officially an ADA thing yet, but I'm waiting. And politically, I personally want to do over the 2016 election. All of these things are just who I am. None of them are things that we're allowed to talk about. Why aren't we allowed to talk about them at work? So there's two types of diversity. There's legal diversity and there's cultural diversity. As a manager, these are the things I tend to think about. The first one is, as a company, you kind of need to stay on top of it so you don't get sued. The second one is how you run as a company and how you interact with each other as a common workforce. So let's start with legal. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is primarily the reason there are posters in all of the break rooms and locker rooms at any work environment talking about your rights as an employee. It's founded in 1965 in support of the Civil Rights Act, in particular Title VII, which talked about the ways that it is now constitutionally illegal to discriminate. You can see there race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. That's kind of a short list compared to what my list was. So what happened? Well, they realized over time they missed things like age, physical disability, veteran status. Other things that you can see here are now, again, at the federal level, illegal to discriminate against, including all of the things that I talked about myself. I want to give a particular shout out to UC Santa Cruz and the Human Genome Project for making sure that our genetic information was not copyrighted, so go slugs. Citizenship is another one that's pretty interesting, and it's kind of a hot ticket item, but it is in fact illegal to discriminate on the basis of citizenship also. So the laws are always changing, they're constantly being challenged, but as a manager, there's something that I always have to keep on top of. Additionally, beyond federal, the state of California has other protections. You can't discriminate federally on the basis of gender, but you could technically discriminate on the basis of needing to breastfeed. California says that that's not okay. Marital status, military status, not just veteran, other types of things. You can see here down at the bottom that these are almost certainly laws that were put into practice due to lawsuits. Even requesting a protected status had to be specified. But these are all things that are really important and ways in which you as an employee should be protected in the workplace in the state of California. All right, so I've gotten all of my legal things out of the way, and as a manager, you usually have to take classes and tests once a year to prove that you know all that stuff so you don't get your company sued. Let's talk about the really interesting diversity. Let's talk about cultural diversity. And it really is about the act of recognizing we are not a homogeneous population and understanding these differences is important. And more specifically for this talk, I'm focusing on corporate culture and how it relates to gender or ethnic diversity and the relationship it has to corporate success. So 2 reasons to care about diversity: ethical and practical. We're not all the same, and ethically, a society or industry that cares about how everybody is valued is a more just society. And there's a lot of interesting discussions around this. One notable idea that's been getting a lot of airtime is the concept of equality of opportunity. And so if you're up for doing a deep dive into some really heavy political theory, you can go look this up. The folks at Stanford are all over this idea. But for this conversation, we're going to talk about practical reasons for caring about diversity, and in particular for me in high-tech industry. Let's look at a couple examples. In this case, where a little ethnic variety in the workplace could have saved some pain. You may have seen these memes going around a couple of years ago. If you Google racist soap dispensers, you'll get all the video and commentary you could ever want. Picture on the top left is a guy allegedly staying at a Marriott hotel somewhere in this country. He is Black. I'm not sure what his name is. That doesn't come out in most of the videos, but he has a friend named Larry who is not Black. And as you can see from these pictures, they are recording the fact that the soap dispenser only works for Larry. Larry, go, wash your hands. On the right are some other gentlemen in a public restroom somewhere in this country, and they're in a similar circumstance. The guy with dark skin can't get the soap to come out until he uses a white paper towel. The problem, of course, in both cases, is that the soap dispensers use light sensors, and those sensors were almost certainly entirely tuned to how light reflects off of light skin. Was this done on purpose? Probably not. But there's obvious bummer consequences. If I do a little back of the envelope calculation, the number of people who are affected by this, look, most of Africa, big chunks of India, the Caribbean, and really any country with a significant African descent population, potential worst case scenario of close to 2 billion unhappy customers. It's probably not 2 billion, it's probably more like just 1 billion. That's not so bad, right? Yeah, that's really bad. In the United States alone, African American, Hispanic, Asian, and Indigenous consumers represent $3.9 trillion of economic buying power. If you've just alienated a whole bunch of them, that's lost revenue. Let's keep going. Virtual reality. It is definitely sexist. Why is it sexist? Well, as you can see, as many as 78% of women suffer from motion sickness. Women represent about 50% of the target customer base in the software gaming industry, which has pretty significant financial impact. If only they had had some women involved in design and testing of your Oculus Rift or your HTC Vive, they could have saved themselves some money, or earned more money in this case. How much money? Well, about this much money. This is estimated annual revenue. Well, it might be up now since everyone's staying home and playing Animal Crossing, but $463 million of annual gaming revenue potential for female consumers in software gaming, right? So there's real financial impact here. Here's some more official validation of this idea of economic impact. So in 2015, McKinsey Company, which is a very respected management consulting and business research organization, published a report that showed the following. Companies in the top quartile for racial and ethnic diversity are 35% more likely to have financial returns above the respective national industry median. Okay? Companies in the top quartile for gender diversity are 15% more likely to have those returns. So if we think about racist soap dispensers and sexist VR rigs in conjunction with this data, a picture starts to emerge of a company with a strong value and diverse employee base is probably not going to make the same kind of mistakes that those other companies made, which means there won't be a lost revenue. But let's go beyond not making mistakes and get even nerdier about potential economic benefit of diversity in the workplace. In 2018, the Boston Consulting Group published a study that examined 1,700 companies across 8 countries and discovered there was a statistically significant relationship between leader-supported cultural diversity and innovation outcomes in every country they looked at. So leader-supported meaning there's active investment in diversity in the workplace, not just nice talking points, and there is a difference. And to be honest, charts like this kind of make my eyes bleed. No, they really make my eyes bleed. But the important takeaway is that dotted line rising as it goes to the right. It's telling us that the more diverse the company is, the more innovation the company is benefiting from. It's not just about making mistakes, it's also about a heterogeneous set of knowledge and perspectives leading to new and better ideas, which leads to improved financial results. So as a manager, I am very aware that the majority of my future employees are going to go to college, most likely. And when I look at the data, it's not super awesome what's going on out there. So in 2018, a study was published by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and it didn't have great news. So if you look at the percentage of computer science related bachelor's degrees given to women, it peaked over 30 years ago, even before I was in school, though I wasn't that much farther along. It dropped precipitously for a long time, and now it's sort of slowly starting to crawl back. And here we have bachelor's degrees conferred to underrepresented minorities, which in the United States generally refers to Black, Hispanic, or Indigenous populations. And you can see that there's actually a slow climb since the mid-70s. However, you can also note that the slow climb is at the very bottom of the chart. At no point has it peaked over 11%, right? So this is not awesome. The Association for Computing Machinery released another study called Retention in Computer Science Undergraduates. And it shows that in most cases, we are seeing a decline, also similarly to the last report. But in both cases, the data only goes through 2015. So a lot has happened since then. And let's look at this. Here in the ACM numbers, you can see some climb, which is good. Let me call out the fact that the number of institutions reporting on this changed over the years during the study. So this isn't an exact science, but it's a pretty good ballpark. And reasonably steady increase, okay. If you had looked at that previous slide, you might have seen a tiny little blip at the end. But if you look at the breakdowns, the picture gets a little bit more confusing. With the exception of the Asian population, the numbers are either declining or flat. And also none are unknown. I appreciate people's desire to want to stay anonymous in certain cases, but from a research perspective, I'm really curious as to what those numbers actually represent over on the far right. But you can clearly see for Black, Hispanic, and white, there is a sort of a steady decline over the years. And then the Asian women in particular are going like gangbusters. Let's look at the men. So total number of male students from participating institutions. Again, you see a peak, kind of, there was a big boom, I think, that happened right after that, the 2011 timeframe. And it's kind of a slow climb over the latter years of the study. But again, we see that it for Black, Hispanic, and white populations, it's either flat or trending downwards. With Asian men, it's climbing upwards. The other thing that you want to notice, though, is the overall ratio. If you look at the numbers of men versus women, there are still far more men than women in computer science, but the women is where we're seeing the most growth across ethnic diversity. Asian women peaked at around 30% versus 24% for the men. Black women peaked at around 10% versus 5% for the men. And then for Hispanics, it was 21% versus 17%. Again, this is ballpark roughly, but it is showing the strong potential for underrepresented women in particular to grow our diversity numbers in high tech. So how do we improve? There is some growth. There is some good news. So let's talk about that. Oops. And they call out the that same ACM report that showed that last round of numbers showed these proposals for improvement. So it's the same research. And it boiled down to these four key interventions. They're categories for improving enrollment and retention of students in CS degree programs. So a lot of credit around these interventions lies with Harvey Mudd College specifically, especially since the arrival of Maria Klabe. She was the first woman to be president at Harvey Mudd, first woman president, and also I think the first computer scientist, if I remember correctly. And she not only reinforced ongoing diversity efforts, she expanded on them to try and address gender and ethnic gaps she saw in computer science and other STEM-related programs. And as of now, Harvey Mudd has essentially achieved gender parity with around 50% female students in computer science, physics, and engineering majors. I couldn't find the latest stats for ethnic representation, unfortunately, but I hope these numbers will become available at some point. So first category, giving students a better understanding of computer science. So required intro to computer science is one of the first changes Harvey Mudd made to create engagement opportunities with students who might otherwise never have considered the major. Peer ambassadors, especially ones in a shared demographic, are incredibly useful to help reinforce positive messaging. The teaching staff will need tools to ensure they know what to do with a diverse student body. And also with parents, help overcome any misconceptions or fears a student may have, especially if they've watched movies like Revenge of the Nerds. That's not really what it's about. And then finally, compelling context around courses that show how technology intersect with art, music, medicine, and the humanities can also be a huge motivator. Okay, next category, meet students' varied backgrounds. You can see there summer bridge programs, one of many ways that incoming freshmen can get a more level playing field coming to the fall classes. It's just a reality that not all high schools have the same resources, so this is one way to help address some of those gaps for incoming freshmen. Tutoring and additional electives recognize that all gaps may not be addressable in a summer program, so students should have an opportunity to succeed on an ongoing basis. For myself, I remember the introductory sequence at Santa Cruz as CS 12A and 12B. We were taught data structures using the Pascal programming language. It was my first time ever programming, and afterwards, most of my classes were done in either assembly or C, where developing language proficiency was an exercise left to the student, and I frankly wasn't very good at it. These days, if you look at Harvey Mudd, for example, they split their sequence into a couple of categories. One section is for the class for ranked beginners, such as myself, who had never programmed before. Another section is for people who have had some experience, but not a ton. A third section, called green, is for beginners, but all the applications in that section have to do with biology in support of budding biotechnologists. And then the fourth one was for people who really didn't need an introductory class at all. So they kind of race through all of the required curriculum and then do some extra fun stuff at the end that maybe touched on some upper division concepts, but nothing that substantially increased the gap between themselves and the other students. The goal was to make sure everyone was pretty much on the same footing for the second sequence of classes. And also notice that this is not holding the advanced students back. If anything, it's making the intro sequence, which is required, less boring. It's not about lowering standards. It's just recognizing that you can't assume everybody is on the same page from the get-go. All right, increase of helpful collaboration. As a manager, an employee who's a productive collaborator is pure gold. Software development is a team sport, and a highly competitive college experience is not only detrimental to a large swath of the student population, it develops habits that I don't want to see in the work environment. I have had to retrain new college hires on a regular basis to have a more positive mindset about collaborative culture. When I was taking my operating systems class at Santa Cruz, I simply could not get my memory module working, and I needed it for everything else I was doing. I understood in principle, but I couldn't get a working example. In desperation, I grabbed a friend of mine's code that worked, carefully attributed it to him in the comments along with my broken code and everything I had tried, and then implemented everything else that I needed for the project so I wouldn't just completely bomb. I then prayed that I wouldn't get, failed. Turns out I did get a little dinged, but not badly, and it was an important life lesson for me. Yes, we want to learn as much as possible, but knowing how to work as a team is also super important because we're all going to have different strengths and weaknesses. Ultimately, having a culture where students feel inadequate on a regular basis does not encourage retention. And given how many jobs need to be filled in high-tech industry annually, this whole weeding out the weak culture stereotype should be dead and buried. Speaking of culture, data shows that even the simplest outreach can have great results. When I started the major, I was afraid to go to office hours because I felt like such an idiot all the time. It got me getting to know some of my professors like Tracy Larrabee that gave me more confidence to get over myself and ask for help. Affinity groups is the next step after peer ambassadors. And these types of organizations are also hugely successful in the workplace. At Google, we have employee resources groups like Black Googlers Network and OLA and GWE, which stands for Google Women Engineers. A sense of community can be a really powerful thing. The same with mentors. What's good in college is also good in the workplace. There's a myth that people are naturally good at certain things to the point that in the old days, vocational tests would steer students into different academic tracks or even away from academic tracks altogether, and students would be focused into the trade skills because it was assumed they shouldn't even bother with college. The reality is that most things can be mastered with effort and practice. Does everybody have the ability to be Albert Einstein? Probably not. Do you have to be Albert Einstein to get a bachelor's degree in physics and get a good job? No. And let me be frank. I was a pretty mediocre computer science student, starting from seeing everybody around me who seemed to know a lot more than I did to feeling like an idiot. And many times I felt really unmotivated. And I'm one of those people who's really bad at taking tests. But I had support and I put in a lot of hard work. And in the end, I've had a really successful career. It had nothing to do with any natural talent because I assure you, I have none. But finally, reinforcing what we said a couple of slides ago about how we needed to give teaching staff the tools to positively engage a diverse student body, that whole idea of positive culture is a daily practice. As human beings, we're naturally inclined to have biases. So we have to work to make sure we recognize when our bias is having a negative effect so we can address it. More research. So I would love to see more. As you saw, some of the studies that I referred to, the research stopped at 2015. It takes a lot of time to do research, and hopefully studies are ongoing. So in a couple of years, we can see another round of how we're doing. And Harvey Mudd, in many ways, started as kind of a small revolution that other institutions are studying and emulating. MIT, Carnegie Mellon, some of the really kind of elite Ivy League type schools are looking very hard at Harvey Mudd and emulating their practices, and we're starting to see some results in recent years. And I really hope this trend continues. But as we saw at the beginning of the talk, we still have some problems in the workplace. So what happened there? In 2012, Google launched an initiative called Project Aristotle to try and quantify what makes a successful team. Because the fact of the matter is, some teams were performing better than others, and the more successful team is, the more they're likely to impact your business in a positive way. So when Google was done, they came up with this conclusion: 5 principles that Google tries to develop and support in the workplace through training and policy. And wouldn't you know it, a lot of the same things that are being shown to have a positive effect on the success of students in college are also being shown to have a positive effect on employees. According to Project Aristotle, psychological safety is the #1 thing that's needed for a successful team. That's a whole lot like, for example, having a sense of belonging and building a safe learning culture, right? The #4 category. Technology is always changing, so we always need to be learning and trying new things. We need to feel safe doing so, and by safe meaning you're not going to get fired or shunned if you try something and fail. We need to know that our team has our back, hopefully like our professors and classmates have our back. The great news is that it's not like building a positive culture that supports the psychological safety only helps out women or only helps out people of color. It ultimately, it helps out everybody. And if we collectively build out these positive cultural systems long enough, my hope is that we get to stop talking about underrepresented minorities in tech because they won't be underrepresented anymore. That's a big ask, and it's kind of a long way out if ever, but we're getting there. We just have to keep paying attention to the data. And I wrap my talk up. You can find me hanging out on LinkedIn, Twitter, Medium. I have a podcast called Women Who Code Radio. These are the 4 organizations that I have affiliation with. Abigail mentioned Women Who Code, Chick Tech, and Code 2040. I'm also affiliated with Google's program, which is Women Tech Makers, which is where the first version of this talk was presented last year. And to answer Abigail's question, Code 2040 is a fantastic organization that helps the hireability of Black and Latino students into internships, which improves their conversion rate into full-time employees. Happy to answer any questions about any of this stuff. And that is the end of my slide deck. All right. Melissa, do we have questions?
Yes, give me 1 second. Okay, we're gonna start with a big fan of yours, Tracy Larrabee.
Tracy.
As I want to know if Tara saw the article about my closing my equity gaps in CE16 or CE16.
No, I would like to see that. CE16 was the first class I had with Tracy, and I remember struggling mightily over probabilities.
Okay, another question. Why do you think the number of computer science degrees awarded to women fell so sharply in 1980?
You know, I could not find good data on that. I do have good data for why it fell again in the early 2000s, which has a whole lot to do with the sort of the transition of computer science from being kind of the nerd major to the place to make money major. There was a whole category of students who may have otherwise gone into law or business. You know, if you're, well, you won't remember, most of you, if you're students, so you weren't alive yet, but there was a movie that came out with Michael Douglas, I think it was called Greed or something like that. And it was all about going to Wall Street and making money as a hedge fund manager or whatever. But then the IPOs started happening. I mean, I was at Netscape. That was one of the biggest IPOs that had happened to date. And it really changed the type of people who came into computer science majors and then into the industry. And it became, that's when the whole idea of programmers started to become a thing, and it became a very hostile environment. Women's participation in high tech dropped as low as 18%. And that's really, really low. Okay. Yeah, I'd love to find out why it dropped so much in the 80s.
Yeah, it's a great question. Here's another one. How do I know whether the company I want to work at has a welcoming culture for diverse employees?
Oh, fantastic question. So first of all, there's a great website called Glassdoor, and I think there are other companies that are very similar where you can go and read reviews written by employees about the company. Some of the reviews are written by people who have left the company, so they might be a little harsher. But other people are feeling, who are current employees may write something nice. But that's kind of a good touch point. There's also been quite a few blogs and articles written about the sorts of questions that you can ask And asking questions about certain types of things that are of interest to you is completely legit. It's actually a blog post I've been considering writing for a while, so maybe I'll finally get around to that. But you can, certain things like, what are your policies around pregnancy leave or family leave? Now, after the current circumstances, how did your company handle the COVID crisis? You can see examples all over the place about companies who were laying off people right and left. There was some guy in Texas who laid off 40,000 employees almost instantly and claimed he was doing them a favor so they could be at the front of the line at unemployment. Like, that's not somebody you want to work for in the future. So there's ways you can do it. And whoever asked that question, if you want to ping me on LinkedIn, I can get you some resources on that.
Great. How can I talk about wanting to work in a diverse environment when I am applying for a job? Will that seem weird or not serious?
Well, that's a good question. And I think it will seem weird to some people. And that right there is a tell. You probably don't want to work there. Mm-hmm. But asking, what sort of diversity demographics a company has, not all companies are public about it, but if you ask them in an interview, I think that's a fair question. You can ask whatever you want, right? And whatever is important to you, if they have a negative reaction, that's probably a sign that that's not a good spot for you to go.
Okay, UCSD had
one quick follow-up.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, the people you'll want to talk to about that is whoever the hiring manager is or the HR rep, but I'd pick the hiring manager. So just figure out who's in which role when you're doing the interview.
Okay, UCSD has impacted CS department. How do we balance creating a diverse student population while admitting qualified students when that isn't always the most diverse pool?
Okay, so if you go to my Medium link, the last article I wrote is actually called Sacrificing Professional Standards. It's around how to hire for a diverse workplace rather than select student bodies. But it does talk about how the systems that we have are inherently biased. Again, as I referred, we're naturally biased people. That's how human evolution works mentally. We have the things that we're drawn to or pushed away from. So to make those improvements is understanding where are those biases impacting our selection process. And bias can be anything. It can be which state you come from, which school you went to. The fact of the matter is, there's some high schools that are on whatever that America World Report, top 10 high schools in the United States, whatever that article comes out every year, top 10 colleges. There's a cachet, I guess, of coming from one of those schools, and that's going to sound better and look better than somebody who went to a high school in East Palo Alto. I mean, that's a bias, right? And so it takes effort. The hiring committee and whatever the policy is has to do the work to figure out what those biases are and then focus on what actually is going to be a student that we want to bring in. What are the things that are beyond the standard list that could be beneficial? And that can be a really complicated conversation. The good news is that there are a lot of companies that those companies do now is help you figure that process out, because it is very complicated, and you can hire them to come in on consult. It's throwing money at the problem. And then they can help you identify what are the key ways that we can make improvements without sacrificing quality, because that's not actually what it is. That's the thing that we assume is the problem. That's not the problem. The problem is the way that we approach how we look at and evaluate people on their own merits. It's not a great answer, sorry, but
it's fine.
It's a complicated question.
What was your first job like?
My first tech job?
Yes.
Okay, so that's a great question. So when I was graduating, there were two companies in particular that most Santa Cruz students tended to gravitate towards because they were local. There were more than two companies in Santa Cruz, but there were two in particular. And the one that I wanted to go to initially was a company called Santa Cruz Operations, which had a Unix system called SCO. And the reason that I wanted to go there, like many of the students wanted to go there, is because they had a hot tub. And they were down the hill from campus. It was a small shop. It was very cool and very funky. But I did not get a job there because I was not a stellar student, as I indicated. I ended up getting a job at a company called Borland, which is still around in some form. They were up the road in Scotts Valley, and there was a lot of Santa Cruz students there, and we all tended to refer each other. So they annually would take some number of students, and I managed to get a job there on their release engineering team. I had no idea what I was doing. It was pretty painful, but it was also a lot of fun, and I was surrounded by fellow classmates or ex-classmates. And I worked 60 hours a week, mostly out of shame, because I felt like I wasn't smart enough and wasn't working hard enough. It took me a long time to get over that, but it was fun. It was a good time.
Great. Here's a question. COVID-19 is having a big impact on the economy. Are there areas in tech or types of companies that you think will do well in the next few years?
Well, there's the $64 billion question, right? That's something that's being figured out right now really fast. Companies that provide digital services are doing really well. Like Amazon is probably making more money than it thought possible, for example. Companies that are doing really poorly are ones that provide AV services in conjunction with maybe website development for conferences, right? Because that whole business is completely changing. But that's not universally true, and we're definitely seeing some surprising results. Airbnb, Lyft, Uber, they're all being hit because a lot of their product revolves around physical presence. But there are other companies, and the name is escaping me right now, that was able to make a transition. I read an article about this a couple of days ago. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name. That have adapted. So I think the answer is, how adaptable are you? And is the product or services that you're offering something that can be modified? And it may need to be something that is true over time. Like, who knows how long this particular circumstance is going to last? But it's probably not the last time we're going to be in a circumstance like this, right? We got very complacent about everybody's traveling everywhere and eating everything and meeting everyone, and something like this hits, and it's causing us to have to think how we're going to engage moving forward.
Great.
But yeah, it'll be really interesting to see what the industry looks like a year from now.
Absolutely. There's a question here. What was it like as a woman in computer science program?
Well, it's interesting because when I was in school, there was a fair number of really great students. It was probably about 30%, I'm going to guess, which is, now that would be, at some schools, that would be considered unholy large. I never felt an issue. The gender was not the thing that was my challenge. Stupidity, that sort of the self-considered stupidity was the thing that I struggled with. But I can also say that, the computer science program was quite small. The Baskin Center was in a much smaller building than it is now. Everybody knew each other. We all kind of, we would congregate in either McHenry Library or a coffee shop somewhere. I spent a lot of time, what's the pizza place at Porter? I forget what that's called. And we just did a lot of group studying and kind of carried each other along. I would not have graduated without the amazing classmates that I had helping me with my homework and helping me study for tests that I was really bad at passing.
Does Google have outreach programs that our students should know about?
What doesn't Google have? So the Google Intern Program, I'm sure, is famous. I mean, they even made a movie about it. Google Women Tech Makers, there's student bodies, there's actually student ambassadors. I think they do outreach into colleges. And then Google also funds a bazillion other organizations. Google is a contributor to Code 2040. That's I was a mentor for that organization before I got to Google. But once I got to Google, that got escalated because now Code 2040 has alumni, postgraduate participants, and so we're doing kind of corporate level mentorship there. So Google's outreach is primarily the internship program. There's also Google Summer of Code, so any student anywhere can submit a project, an open source project, and if they can pick up a mentor or a sponsoring organization, they can do it that way. There's a million ways that Google tries to engage with students.
Okay, what advice would you give to a 2020 CS graduate?
That's a very broad question. Apply everywhere. Understand what the company does before you apply. If you write a cover letter, make it a paragraph, maybe 2 at most. And while you're waiting to get a job, find yourself an open source project and start coding.
I have a question for you. Your first job that you had, you said you had to work a lot of hours and just put a lot of energy into it. When did you start to feel confident in setting your own boundaries as an employee and to ask for the things that you needed from your managers?
I still have problems with that. There's a couple of things to unpack there. One, that sort of those early internet days, and I think that still happens some places, thankfully less now, but those early internet days of, oh, I worked 80 hours this week or 100, I mean, I worked between 100 and 120 hours for 7 months at Netscape when we were creating Mozilla.org. We were sleeping under our desks. In retrospect, at the time I felt like, I'm a Marine, you know. In retrospect, I'm like, that was the stupidest corporate, it just blows my mind how dumb that was. Because let me tell you something, after about hour 60, I don't care how good you are, you're not thinking clearly. As a manager looking back on that, I'm like, no wonder it took us so long to get Mozilla.org, you know, launched. We were practically drunk when we were coding, right? So that's one thing. So that I started putting my foot down as I realized that you just make bad decisions when you're tired. But beyond that, you know, that's kind of a personality thing. I don't like asking, I always have that kind of back of my head imposter syndrome thing that's never really gone away. So I have to work at it, and I have to think about deliberately, like, am I just kind of shooting myself in the foot right now, or should I just go talk to my director and tell him what I need? I'm a firm believer of fake it till you make it. I've never made it, so I fake it a lot. And I kind of just pretend to have the confidence that I'm portraying. In the end, the end result is I get what I need, even if I felt really awkward about it.
And with that, what is your ultimate career goal? The nice lead in.
My ultimate career goal, it's interesting that you asked that, because it's only recently that I admitted to myself that I had one. I actually want to stay at Google for a little while, I don't know, a couple more years. I'm learning a lot, because you never stop learning. But then I want to go back to small companies. My goal now is to find a small company that needs someone who really cares about how companies are run, sort of the mechanics of it, both culturally, technically, and become COO. So
Nice.
We'll see if that ends up happening. But I decided to let myself have that goal. It took a while for me to get there.
Nice. Okay, a question here. Can you comment on the quote pipeline question? Where are interventions most effective? College, high school, earlier?
Yes. I mean, it's the interventions are just different depending on where you're at. I'm at this point a pretty firm believer that the sort of basic coding skills, intro to data structures, that kind of stuff. Like my 9-year-old and I are hacking around, and we're making a Python version of Zork, which is a game I played when I was her age back in the early 80s, a text-based adventure game. I think it's a core skill at this point. You hear this joke, in the 90s, they said every company is a healthcare company because of the need to provide healthcare services for employees became the default rather than the exception across all industries. And then it was every company is a software company, and it is so true. A lot of the companies that I work with, customers I talk to, they're banks, they're retailers, they're gaming companies. Like, everybody has to do software now. And so I think from a national educational standard level, I think coding skills should start as soon as maybe, definitely middle school, maybe fifth grade, late elementary. So that's one thing. And whether or not that will happen, who knows? But then again, from an industry standpoint, more and more companies are realizing, hey, organizations like Chick Tech, Girls Who Code, and similar, and there's hundreds of them now, investing in those nonprofit organizations to help engage students at the high school level, because that's where most of it tends to go, helps build the pipeline into the college organizations, and then subsequent funding into nonprofit organizations at the college level helps ensure that we're getting the pipeline out, with degreed students who can then come into the workforce. And then the other thing, no offense to Santa Cruz, excellent school, getting a bachelor's degree is a wonderful thing. but it's also not necessary to get a bachelor's degree to be in high-tech industry. And so boot camps for people, or maybe you got a bachelor's degree in something other than computer science and you want to get into tech. So either way, boot camps can be a way to get a base set of coding skills that enable all kinds of jobs. You're not going to get deep, low-level jobs that require like understanding of how the processors work. That's fine. There's not actually as many of those types of jobs anyway, but there's always going to be need for web developers, right? And so if you think about high-tech industry as basically almost every possible thing within the industry itself, anybody can get a job, right? It's just finding the right job for your skill set and your interest.
How can we best prepare our students for a long career rather than simply a quote first job?
I think if I got anything out of my tenure at Santa Cruz, it's the concept of tenacity. You just don't stop, right? You don't give up, and you're going to have bad jobs. It could be your first job, which would really suck, but it happens. You just know that there's a base set of skills that you've gotten that aren't the specific knowledge that you've attained, but the fact that you had to struggle to learn, right? And that idea of a learning culture is going to persist. And so no matter what happens, you have within you the ability to make a change in some powerful way. And that's going to take you to the next job. And you may end up, there's folks that I know that went in one direction and came back into tech. There's a woman I know, she got a bachelor double major in law and psychology. She actually got her, she passed the bar. But then she realized for what she wanted to do, she needed to learn how to code because there was a technology aspect of what she was trying to achieve. So then she became a programmer for a while, and now she's back out using her programming skills doing the type of work that she's doing. And I've seen that go back and forth a bunch of different ways. And I think that's kind of the beauty of having achieved that bachelor's degree. It's not that you have a bachelor's degree in computer science and now you can go be a software engineer. It's like you've achieved a bachelor's degree. You are an educated, smart person, and you can do whatever you want.
Thanks. Can you talk a little bit more about how to help others who have imposter syndrome?
Oh, imposter syndrome. Oh. Okay, well, first of all, it doesn't just affect women. Let's just get that out of the way. One of the worst cases of imposter syndrome I know personally was someone who normally you would think, he's got everything. He's a white guy who's a principal engineer, but he had terrible imposter syndrome, and principal engineers are often required to, give presentations and speak to customers or whatever, and he would throw up at the thought of having to talk to anybody in that way. It really can hit everybody. And in fact, one of the interesting things when I got to Google is they talk about how everybody at Google has imposter syndrome because Google has such a sort of this mythical reputation. There's some stuff at Google that's kind of amazing, but everybody at Google puts their pants on one leg at a time, as the saying goes. And we all kind of look at each other like, that guy's really smart. That woman's really smart. There's Ana Corrales, who's the general manager for Google Hardware. Like, she's unreal. She's so cool. Sanjay Gupta, Vint Cerf, who's one of the inventors of the internet. They all work at Google now, and it's kind of fascinating. But I also had some of my employees came out of a boot camp, right? And they're just as smart and just as capable. And so it's just constantly looking around and knowing that, hey, everybody has their thing. Their thing that either helps build them up or the thing that builds them down. And again, from a manager perspective, it's recognizing that since we all have that thing, there's another example of where we're all kind of in this together. So talking to people, finding support groups. I mentioned I'm in OLA, which is the ERG for Hispanic students. I'm also in Gaglers for the gay community, and Greyglers for the old people, and GUI for the women engineers. And sometimes it's just, lunch, talking to people, hearing their stories, listening to them venting yourself. You start to hear the same types of fears and challenges from other people that you yourself have, and it kind of helps reinforce that, okay, it's not just me, right?
Are there affordable boot camps for students out of college without tech degrees?
Yes. There's a bunch of different programs. A real interesting one, it's called Income Share something. It's the boot camp. You basically pay a fee to get started, but you don't pay tuition until you get your first job. And some really good boot camp programs will do that now. Plenty of boot camps offer scholarships. Plenty of organizations, Women Who Code, for example, offers scholarships to take a boot camp. And there are other organizations as well, Society for Black Engineers, Society for Hispanic Engineers. A lot of these organizations will have some types of scholarship funds to help with that. Another thing you can get financial assistance with is going to conferences. Networking is an amazing thing to do, to meet people and to hear about other companies and maybe get your resume into people's hands. So that's another opportunity. And they can be kind of expensive. Like to go to Google Next, I think is like $4,500 or something. So anyway, there's lots of assistance out there financially for people who need it.
Okay.
I'm going to break in. This has been really wonderful. I invite students and other participants. Last call for questions. Anybody else have any additional questions? We'll take a look at the Q&A box and see.
And like I said, if you hit me up on LinkedIn or find me on Twitter, I will do my best to get back to you.
And
all right. Oh,
well,
sorry,
okay.
Melissa, go ahead.
I said one question, and this will be our last question. How is advancing diversity integrated into the annual review process? If not, how could it be?
Annual review process for who?
Probably in the workforce, I imagine.
For annual review process for employees, I think is the question.
That depends on the company. Google just released its annual diversity report, but that's an entirely volunteer effort. Most of the big firms will do that. Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon, I believe, also have diversity reports. The diversity report for Google this year was interesting. It showed great strides in the hiring of Black employees, but it showed equally unfortunate looking results in retention. So, I mean, but the fact that Google is constantly doing that, and I actually do have conversations with some of the folks over in the HR department, people ops is what we call it, about how we can try and make improvements in those numbers. Not that I'm like an important person, but they respond to my emails, which is great. It's a constant battle, and you constantly have to be thinking about it. And again, like I said, it's a daily practice. Diversity and inclusion is a daily practice.
All right. Well, listen, thank you so much to all of our participants for spending this time together. Tara, we are so grateful to you. This has been really fascinating. Thank you for sharing all this insight, your experiences, your advice. We are very, very grateful. Students, stay strong. We know that this is a very, very difficult quarter, and we're proud of you for your toughness. And to my colleagues, thank you so much for helping bring this about. Good luck, everyone, and thank you.
Oh, go Slugs.